series, How to Fight the Anti-Israel Misinformation Campaign. This event is co-hosted by Kerem House and Israeli Politics Simplified. Kerem House is a community-focused organization based in Tel Aviv. Kerem House has run 226 events prior to COVID for Israelis and internationals alike. Now, with the easing of restrictions, you can expect more in-person events from Kerem House. Check out their events page for more information. I'd also like to wish happy birthday to Daniel Elgbogen, who is one of the co-founders of Kerem House. So happy birthday, Daniel. Israeli Politics Simplified is a Facebook page dedicated to bringing Anglos in Israel unbiased, easy to understand information about Israeli politics. I'm Meira Lerner, creator of the Israeli Politics Simplified page, and I will be your host tonight. Over the past few months, Kerem House and Israeli Politics Simplified have worked together to produce our virtual event series titled Poli-Talks, meant to inform and empower English speakers to make informed decisions that can impact their lives in Israel. During the lead up to the recent Israeli elections, we interviewed candidates from parties across the spectrum, as well as analysis events. We are proud to say that the series has amassed over 12,000 views between our different stream talks. We've also started a new initiative, producing interesting talks that bring value not directly connected to politics, such as our recent discussion with Rafael Cohen from the World Zionist Organization about the WZO and Zionism today. Moving forward, we hope and plan to bring you more valuable content and continue the Poli-Talks series with more interviews with Knesset members and analysts and commentary on current events in Israeli politics and the Jewish world. Today, we'll be tackling an issue that has taken on global significance. In the past few weeks, we have seen a rise in anti-Semitism and anti-Israel movements around the world. Beginning just before the recent Israeli-Gaza fighting, there has been a massive misinformation campaign relating to events in Israel, the history of Israel, and about Jews in general. This campaign has reached mainstream media, social media, influencers, and commentators. Everyone from Gigi Hadid to John Oliver, from CNN to the New York Times, has taken part in this PR information battle, and so far is showing no signs of slowing down. Today, we will try to understand what has happened in Israel and Gaza over the last few weeks, how it's playing out in the media, and what we can and should be doing to fight the misinformation battle. Joining us to explore all of this is Lev Yuriditsky. Lev was born in Russia, raised in the US, and lives in Tel Aviv. He holds a bachelor's degree in economics and a master's in Middle Eastern studies. He recently took on the role of head of intelligence for Scope, an intelligence firm specializing in the financial sector. Prior to that, he spent 2 years working for the United Nations in Jerusalem, handling civil-military coordination. Before the UN, Lev served as a regional director for Max Security Solutions, a geopolitical risk consulting firm in Tel Aviv. With that, it is my pleasure to introduce Lev Yuriditsky. Welcome, Lev.
Thank you, Meira. It's a pleasure to be here. Thank you for having me.
So there's a lot to unpack here of everything we just discussed. We know that there's been a lot that's gone on in the last month in Israel and the US and the Jewish community all over the world. Before we really get into the heart of the matter, I'd love if we could hear a little bit more about your background, your experience in Israel, and particularly with the United Nations here.
Sure. So my background, basically, I moved to Israel about 10 years ago. Yeah, in 2011, so almost exactly 10 years ago, sometime in October. And I did my master's in Middle Eastern Studies, focusing on mostly security issues and international relations within the region. I studied Arabic, I studied Turkish for a while as well. And I say that not to brag, there's relevancy with that. It kind of gives you a bit more exposure to different resources and things like that. And then, as you mentioned earlier, I worked for Max Security, which was a geopolitical risk consulting firm. And I had many roles there. I worked there for 4 years. So I was an analyst, I was a manager, a director. And during one of those times, it was for about 2 years, I was working for the Middle East and North Africa division, covering the Levant, which is the region that we all live in. And there I focused a lot on what's going on in Israel, Palestine. So it gave me a lot of exposure. I read basically every single tweet put out by Hamas, put out by Fatah, by leaders in both parties, by the Israeli government, by Israeli political parties, and so on and so forth. So I feel like I gained a very intimate familiarity with the conflict through that, on top of living here as well. And there's a lot of things that when you have to read everything, when you have to read every tweet, and your clients are depending on you for doing that, that you pick up a lot of details that people miss when they just read the news that kind of summarizes and gets rid of a lot of the details. So I think that's quite important. I also had to familiarize myself with the different factions, which I'll speak about later. After Max, I worked for the United Nations, like you said. I actually was there for 2.5 years, which was a very fascinating experience. Being one of the only Israelis in the United Nations at the time, basically the way it works, and I won't get into details too much, but the United Nations in Israel doesn't consider themselves as working in Israel, and fairly they kind of don't. They work in East Jerusalem and they serve the Palestinian population, not the Israeli population, not for any biased reasons, but because the Israeli government didn't ask them to serve them. Israeli government does fine on their own for providing for their people. But being the only Israeli, being one of the only Jews in the organization, and being privileged with having a UN vehicle, which allowed me to travel in and out of the West Bank peacefully, was something that gave me a lot of exposure. And also just working with the Palestinian community, all my colleagues, or most of my colleagues, are Palestinians, the others were Europeans, having frank conversations, going out to bars and cafes in Ramallah and having normal conversations with people, being very frank about who I am, being very open about who I am. It gave me a really interesting, or gave me a very unique, I guess, opportunity to learn more about the conflict, if you will.
It's certainly an experience that not a lot of Israelis get to have, that's for sure.
Yeah, exactly. And what's interesting also about that time, it just so happens that my office, there's many UN offices, there's dozens in East Jerusalem alone. And the one that I was based out of was in Sheikh Jarrah itself. So it was actually quite interesting when this conflict happened, and when the protests and the sort of uptick in violence happened in Sheikh Jarrah. It was actually really interesting for me to see. I was like, I used to spend most of my days there, so it's kind of cool. And now I work for Scope, which is less relevant to the conflict. We deal with financial crime, money laundering, sanctions, evasion, corruption, and things like that. But so that's where I'm at now in my office there.
So that's a really great way to bring us to our next segment of our talk today. I think it's really important when we talk about the misinformation and various sides of the PR or media battle to give some context to what actually happened, what was going on in Israel on the ground, how did we get to a war with God, like what actually happened. So before the actual operation in Gaza began, there were already tensions, coming to a boiling point between Israel and the Palestinians. A lot of that was stemming from Sheikh Jarrah. We know that played out in the media quite a bit, and as well as the events on the Temple Mount, which were specifically during Ramadan. Do you think you can give us some background on what exactly happened, how this all began, and how that was playing out in the media?
Sure. So firstly, I should say that while usually when it comes to conflicts and things like violent engagements, people focus a lot on the external conflict, so to speak. I think basically the relationship between the two belligerents. So most people think about who are the belligerents, the Israelis, the Palestinians. And when we look for why this happened, we looked at what's happening between them. But a lot of times it's what's happening internally is equally as important. So there's a lot of things that are happening in Israel, in the Palestinian territories, that does have to do with the belligerents and their relations with each other. But these are things that have been going on for a long time. In theory, and practically, you can say that it's had to do with Sheikh Jarrah. I will boil it down to, let's say, maybe I'm making up a number, I think five different factors. For one, Israeli elections and the creation of coalition government. The other one is the Palestinian elections that have been postponed indefinitely. Mainly, there's different Palestinian governing bodies, and this one was specifically for the Palestinian Legislative Council. So the Hamas is quite powerful there. They're the leading party there, but it's kind of been defunct for about 15 years or something along those lines. So those are the kind of two internal things that were going on. In addition, of course, Sheikh Jarrah always has court. There's always court trials going on with regards to Sheikh Jarrah. There are trials about every month. I don't know which stage in the decision-making process these trials were in. I'm not a lawyer, so I can't really say, and the language is kind of complicated there, but there was a trial going on, and at the same time, there was Ramadan. And it might sound counterintuitive for a lot of people, but when you study Islamic militancy, you find that there's always an uptick in violence and kind of passionate violence in a way during Ramadan. And basically because you're supposed to be a better Muslim at that time. And for some people, they interpret that as standing up for the oppressed Muslims. And in this case, that's how they interpreted the actions that they were supposed to take. So there was Ramadan, there was Sheikh Jarrah, there was Al-Aqsa Mosque, there was the Israeli elections, there was a new military chief of staff in Israel, and then there was the internal PLC elections. So I think those would be the main factors that influence this. Also, going beyond my 5 points would be the miscalculation on the part of Hamas. I don't think they expected this sort of escalation. I think they expected Israel to respond as it usually would to these sorts of rockets. Essentially, as one of my good friends said, they expected Israel to just hit another sand dune or something like that. They didn't expect Israel to react by actually blowing things up.
Mm-hmm. I'd like to go a little bit further into the discussion about, in particular, the Palestinian Authority elections and Sheikh Jarrah, because I think those are two of the things that, on the one hand, Sheikh Jarrah has been playing out all over the media. You know, we're seeing hashtags like Save Sheikh Jarrah trending all over social media. So you have that on one side, and on the other side, you have the whole controversy about the Palestinian Authority elections, which don't really seem to be getting as much attention in the media as far as I can see. And it's something that I think not a lot of people know about. For the sake of clarity, do you think you could give us a little bit more of a deeper background and summary of what was actually going on in Sheikh Jarrah, and also what was actually going on with the elections? Because I think it's really important for people to get a fuller perspective of that beyond just, you know, the Twitter hashtags.
Sure. So I'll do my best. Again, these are very nuanced situations, so I could miss on some details. Starting with Sheikh Jarrah, just a bit of background. I think it might be interesting for the listeners to understand the neighborhood a little bit, because like I said, I worked there for 2.5 years. I'm intimate. I spend more time there than I spent in my home. So
Yeah, absolutely.
It's a kind of upper middle class, upscale, I would say leaning towards upscale neighborhood. There are some lower middle class parts of it. It's right after the old city. So if you're going from the central bus station in Jerusalem and taking the light rail, it's the stop afterwards. There are some Jewish holy sites, and there are also some Christian holy sites there. And there's a lot of, and I think Meira, we might have spoke about this over the phone before, that basically, because the UN and the international community sees East Jerusalem as part of Palestine, there's a lot of, if you work for the Palestinians, in a sense, if you're like the Swedish consul for the Palestinians, you're not going to live, you could choose to live in Ramallah or Bethlehem or East Jerusalem, but you can't live in West Jerusalem or Tel Aviv, even if you want to. So because of the proximity of Sheikh Jarrah to West Jerusalem, a lot of people choose to live there and set up their offices there. Which is part of the reason that it became upscale, I believe. There's a lot of mansions there. There's really nice, luxurious apartments there. There's art galleries. It's very kind of, I would say, gentrified sort of area. To an extent, there's also an orphanage I've seen there, and there's some poorer areas, but it's densely-ish populated. There's obviously more densely populated places in Jerusalem, but it's not a suburb by any stretch. In the center of Sheikh Jarrah, there is a cluster of houses with Jewish residents. And it's been there. They've been there ever since I've been in Sheikh Jarrah, and you always see Orthodox walking through there. I've never heard of an attack there in the 2.5 years I've been there. I had my mechanic was there. I had a lot of services there, and every time I went, there were Arabs speaking to Hasidic Jews, and it seemed fine. Obviously, their intentions, business is business, so they were making money. They don't want to stab their customers, but that was kind of the vibe there, and so. The reason I kind of bring that up, I think it's important. And again, I guess I'm kind of speaking to the choir here, and I think not a lot of outsiders will really understand this. But when there's a talk about taking over Sheikh Jarrah, when you're talking about a couple dozen homes, which I think it might have been in the end, you can't really say you're taking over a neighborhood. And there's a lot better homes to take over. The ones the Jews are taking over are like anywhere from dilapidated to just not in best condition. So it wasn't like they were taking over the mansions and the gated houses and things like that. The Sheikh Jarrah is very complicated. It's a legal matter that crosses, I guess, from the Ottoman time to British Mandate time to Transjordanian time to Jordanian ownership of East Jerusalem. So it's very complicated. But essentially, at some point before Israeli independence, there was Jewish organizations that purchased property in Sheikh Jarrah. They owned it, but when Jordan took over East Jerusalem, they were forced out and they were forced to flee, much like Arabs were from other parts of Israel. And it was very common in conflicts at the time, and where the person, the government or the army that takes over a territory can give that property to someone in their own territory. And Jordan did that. Not with every place in Sheikh Jarrah, but Jordan did give a lot of the properties that formerly belonged to Jews. They gave it to usually fleeing Arab families from Israel that were moving into Jordan. They said, here, you can take this Jewish person's home. And when Israel took back the territory, there was a lot of homes that also weren't given to Palestinians. Essentially, that Jordan just neglected them. They allowed people to live there. They said you can stay here as long as you want, but they never formally did the process of transferring ownership. When Jordan transferred ownership to Palestinians, Israel hasn't challenged that. No one's really challenged that because we accept that. Okay, well that's kind of the rule of war at that time. We can't do anything about it. It's in the hands of these people. In the cases of homes that were not transferred to Palestinian ownership, is the Israeli or the Jewish organizations that purchased those properties pre-Israeli independence, they did ask for it back, so to speak. And in some cases, they just reclaimed their ownership, but they allowed the people who were living there, the Palestinian families, to stay and to basically pay rent. Now, as far as I understand, essentially, some of these families started refusing to pay rent. Maybe they believed they owned it. Maybe they misinterpreted the legality of the Jewish ownership. And it's been a legal battle. And that's another thing that I think, in a way, works in our favor if anyone's willing, on the other side, is willing to listen, that if you think about it, this has been going on for about 15 years. If Israel really wanted to take over homes, they would just take over homes. They wouldn't go through legal battles for, again, over a decade and a half at this point. And they would also take over more homes. But the bottom line is that it wasn't every home. It was very specific ones. It was ones that Jordan just didn't go through the process of transferring ownership for. So it's very complex. Your other question with regards to the different Palestinian factions, it's complicated. I mean, there's the Palestinian National Authority, the PA. There's Fatah, which is the main party of the Palestinian National Authority. It's the dominant party. The other ones are pretty much ignorable or negligible. Then there's the Palestinian Liberation Organization, which is basically a carbon copy of the Palestinian National Authority. And then there's the Palestinian Legislative Council, which again has been defunct since I think 2007, if I'm not mistaken. And essentially Hamas is dominant there. So whereas Fatah is dominant in the PLO and the Palestinian National Authority, Hamas won elections, I believe it was 2007, which basically led to PA kind of disregarding it and saying, well, no longer, we don't care about the PLC anymore. The PLO is the Palestinian National Authority is the representative governing body of the Palestinian people. So there's the elections for the PLC have been constantly postponed. It's not the first time. This is just another time, and it's understood that it was postponed because everyone knew that in the PLC elections, for whatever reason, Hamas will win. So that's the story behind it.
So that was more of a conflict between the various Palestinian factions, as opposed to the way I've seen some of the media referring to it as some Israeli intervention or Palestinians being blocked from having an election. This was within the Palestinian factions.
Yeah, they haven't had elections in I think 15 years now. It's just kind of the norm. And to be frank, when I speak to Palestinians about it, about the politics in the Palestinian territories, none of it surprises them, and they're just like, yeah, of course, it's a dictatorship, and there's no democracy, and we don't expect any different. So they never blamed Israel for that, and I don't think any non-conspiracy theory Palestinian believes that Israelis are behind that.
So now both the Sheikh Jarrah incident and the Temple Mount situation and the Palestinian Authority elections, all of those things were taking place within, let's say, Israel proper, within Judea and Samaria, West Bank area. What exactly brought the Gaza region and Hamas into this conflict? Are they separate to the general Palestinian population? Are they part of it? Do they represent it? What was their connection here? How did they get into things?
So I would say it's a battle for representation. They're not separate. I mean, in a way they are. The Gazan population is very kind of isolated, and it's very hard to go in and out. It's very challenging. And even if you want to and you succeed to, you're sacrificing a lot. basically any sort of what we will call family reunification. So any, let's say a West Bank Palestinian chooses to marry an East Jerusalem Arab or Israeli Arab, family reunification takes away a lot of the rights of the Palestinian marrying into the Jewish family, or sorry, the Israeli family. And the same goes for Gazans. If you leave Gaza, it's very, very hard to come back. And so a lot of people don't do it. So they're quite isolated. And obviously very few West Bankers would want to move to Gaza. It's not a pleasant place. So they're isolated, but you know, they're still part of the same culture in a way. They still fight they still believe in the same idea of Palestinian liberation. The same way, it's like, in a way, almost like asking if the Republicans represent Americans or Democrats represent Americans. I mean, there's a lot of people in the West Bank who hate their government enough, and their only kind of rival is Hamas. So they say, well, Hamas at least is not Abbas. And likewise from the other side. So I wouldn't call them, I mean, I guess they're representatives of the Palestinian people, but I would leave that up for the Palestinian people to decide. And the reason that they got involved, and I'll remind you that in 2014, I think it was during that engagement, we have to remember that Hamas got involved when basically 3 Jewish boys were abducted and killed. And when Israel started doing a search operation, which was obviously very thorough, if you will, and that meant a lot of villages are being invaded, a lot of people, it was a very forceful operation, and for good reason. Hamas decided in order to get kind of brownie points, if you will, the Palestinian population, that they decided to engage the Israelis. So that's kind of why they did. And that's important to note that in this case, it was the same. They basically saw an opportunity to stand with the Palestinian people, make themselves relevant, especially in the face of Fatah, because, you know, the West Bank, where Fatah is based out of, is calmer in a way, and much less likely for them as a governing body, as security forces, to engage Israelis in violence. So, you know, for the angry Palestinians who are seeing nothing done from the West Bank, it's very easy for Hamas to get involved and show, well, we're going to stand up for you. We'll stand up for Sheikh Jarrah. We'll stand up for Al-Aqsa. And that was kind of their way of reestablishing a level of relevancy and support amongst the Palestinians, and also, by the way, amongst Israeli Arabs.
So it's interesting that you bring up the Israeli Arabs, because I do want to touch on that a little bit. Something that happened over the last few weeks, certainly over the course of the conflict directly between Israel and Gaza, was almost a new phenomenon, something that we haven't always seen in the past when it comes to Israel and Gaza conflicts. And that was, of course, the violence that broke out within Israel itself, particularly in mixed cities like Lod, Ramla, Akko. I think those are the cities that we heard about the most. Was this in direct response to the conflict with Gaza? Was it more related to what was happening when Sheikh Jarrah and the Temple Mount? There was a lot of talk about how Hamas managed to make themselves connected to the Israeli Arabs within Israel. This is something that was relatively new. Is this something that we can expect again, should there be another escalation with Gaza? And why do you think that happened the way that it did? So
I'll answer the first question first. Basically, you asked if it will happen again. It's a very tough question. It's very hard to tell, because I think a lot of it depends on the reaction of the Palestinian people, or let's say the Israeli Arabs, to what happened. And what I mean by that is, let's take the Intifada, the second Intifada, for instance. So most Palestinians that I know saw the second Intifada and the way that it kind of ruined their lives as a warning sign, and not like a threat, but more like, you know what, we ruined everything, like, for ourselves. They called the period between the 2 Intifadas as a golden era. Gazans can drive to the beach in Yaffo. You know, Jews were coming into Jericho, bringing their money into casinos there. Everything was kind of good. And then the Intifada happened, and they lost their rights. They lost a lot of their privileges. They got put behind walls. People were getting shot all over the place, and most normal civilians don't like that. So it really depends on how people react. And so far, it's hard for me to tell. I haven't read much conversations from Israeli Arabs, but there's been a lot, despite the violence, there's been a lot of realization that, first off, this is coming at a period where Israeli Arabs have been more and more integrated into society, and more, or at least statistically and through polls, seeming like they want to be part of Israel. So for this to come on the heels of that, there's naturally going to be a lot of, I feel like there's going to be more response to, or the reaction is going to be more likely to like, hey guys, let's not do that again. You know, that didn't do any good for us. There was unnecessary violence. So it really depends on how the general population reacts to it. Either they support it and they respond in a way like, you know, let's do that again. You know, we should show those Jews not to mess with us. This is the Lord is ours, whatever, which I don't think is going to be the case, to be honest. I think most Israeli Arabs don't want that. They live a pretty comfortable life. I think they, by and large, they're very aware of the relative comfort that they have. So I don't think that they're going to want to do it again. It led to a lot of unnecessary violence, and I think they'll learn. That's my guess. As far as the other question about why it happened, I mean, there's various reasons. First off, with any kind of civil unrest, all it really takes is to kill an innocent person, and that generates more civil unrest, and more civil unrest can lead to violent crackdowns, right? So if I understand the timeline correctly, essentially when Israeli Arabs were protesting Sheikh Jarrah and what was happening there, which they would do normally. You know, I used to live in Yaffo, and there was always these minor protests surrounding issues with regard that relate to the Palestinians. And I think in this case, if I understand correctly, an Israeli Arab was shot because the protest turned violent. And during the funeral, there were riots, and that's very normal. People were angry at funerals. Why did you kill this young innocent man or his boy? And when a funeral gets unruly, then naturally the security forces step in again. And then when that's kind of being a funeral is supposed to be sacrosanct. So it's like the Al-Aqsa. You can hurt protesters in a normal day, but if you hurt them on Ramadan at Al-Aqsa, you're going to get a different kind of response. So I think people were really upset with the shooting of this person with Sheikh Jarrah, with Ramadan desecration at Al-Aqsa. And so there's already kind of this fervor. In addition to that, Hamas is a very well-organized and calculated organization, and they do have a presence, and they do have some influence in the Israeli Arab sector. So they were fanning those flames, and they were encouraging people to protest and go out on the streets. And then all it takes is you burn down a synagogue in response, right? You beat up a couple of Jews in Yaffo in response to all this, minor incidents, if you will. And then what happens? Jews march through Israeli Arab through the Muslim quarter of Jerusalem, saying "Death to Arabs," and then they burn down a mosque, and then they shoot some Arab, or they beat the shit out of some Arab. Sorry, and then that just kind of fuels the violence. But I really saw during this period that most sides were kind of encouraging calm, and it seemed like it was just the extremists on both sides and that were actually causing the violence.
Okay, so before we get into the real misinformation section of this talk, if you will, because there's definitely a lot to unpack there, I do think it's really important to have a vocabulary lesson, so to speak. I know that people tend to get very confused when we talk about Israel or the West Bank or Judea and Samaria and Palestinians, Hamas, Gaza. There's a lot of very different entities involved. A lot of them, overlap, or they're connected in some way. And we hear these terms thrown out all the time. So I'd love it if we could do a bit of a vocab lesson or terminology lesson. And let's just do a breakdown of who's involved here, who are the players, what are the areas that we're talking about, in particular, Hamas, PA, Gaza, West Bank, and anything else that you think would be important for people to understand. What is it that we're talking about?
Sure. So it's complicated. I think I'll start with the terms that I think are the most conflated or confused. So firstly, let's start with occupation and blockade. So there's a lot of, and settlers, let's start with that as well. So regardless of your political leanings, settlers generally defines people who live in the West Bank, and what most in the world would call the occupied West Bank. There's also a difference between occupied and illegally occupied, right? So again, I'm not a lawyer, I'm not an expert in international law at all. A lot of people, and I think even to some extent, those in the Israeli government and not just on the left, will call the West Bank an occupation. They'll say what they're doing in the West Bank is an occupation. A lot of them will say it's not illegal, which is not my field. I can't comment on that. But there's no real blockade there, but you can argue that there's an occupation. There's a lot of people who, because there's always talks about occupied Palestine, And they apply that to Gaza as well. Gaza is not occupied. There's a blockade from two countries on Gaza, and from land and sea and air. And I think that's just factual. Another thing that gets conflated is East Jerusalem. So for a lot of people, they think of East Jerusalem just as the old parts of the old city, and to some extent Sheikh Jarrah. East Jerusalem also extends over the wall. So if you cross the Kalandia checkpoint in the direction of Ramallah, before you get to Ramallah, you'll cross a lot of area called East Jerusalem, which is kind of no man's land to some extent, because Israel, in some ways, due to them saying that it's theirs, allows for the Palestinian Authority to ignore it. But because it's so hard and so dangerous to get in there, it's a very rough area where even when I drove through there in a UN vehicle with Palestinian colleagues, they never want to stop in there. So it's important to understand that there is East Jerusalem over the other side of the wall. There's also refugee camp. I didn't think about that earlier, but refugee camp is also kind of important to touch on. Maybe most of the Jewish audience, Israeli audience here has a visualization of it. I think most of the Western world, when they hear refugee camp, they think of a camp. Reality, these refugee camps are massive apartment complexes. They're full-blown cities. They're more built up than most cities you'll find in Palestinian territories, and they have universities inside them, literally universities. Let's see, what are some other good terms to demystify apartheid? I think the reason that a lot of people bring up apartheid, and this, I don't want to go too far now and get into misinformation, but it's because they kind of treat the West Bank as part of Israel. And if you look at it that way, there is different administration, different rules, complete different treatment of the Palestinians living under Palestinian control in the West Bank versus the Israeli Arabs who live in Israel proper, if you will. So a lot of people, because they understand that mistreatment, they don't realize, well, it's kind of two separate countries, or should be treated as two separate countries. Israelis aren't allowed to go into the West Bank, into the Palestinian part of the West Bank, which, not to get too far into, the West Bank is divided into areas A, B, and C. C, if I recall, is all Jewish, is all Israeli governed. B is mutual, I think it's Palestinian governed with Israeli security, and then A is fully Palestinian. So when you're in the Palestinian territories, when you're in area A, you really feel like first of all, you're not allowed to be there as an Israeli. I had the privilege of going in there, but it's for my work, and you feel like you're in a different country, and for all intents and purposes, you are in a different country. Palestinian Authority has no control over Gaza, which is kind of its own country in a way, but Hamas is not recognized as the representative of Palestinian people by the international community. That is the Palestinian Authority. I think likely as a result of Yasser Arafat and the Oslo Accords. So those are some. There's a lot of terms that I think is more important to talk about during disinformation. Things like disproportionate, terrorist, colonialism, things like that. But that has more to do with disinformation than it has to do with demystifying certain terms. I hope that clarified. Did I miss any other terms you think are important?
Well, I mean, I think there's sometimes confusion when people refer to the West Bank, Judea and Samaria. Those are
for all intents and purposes, they're the same thing, I would say.
Same thing.
If you look at, when you draw a map of West Bank, you're drawing a map kind of of Judea and Samaria. I'm assuming, historical Judea and Samaria stretches out past the borders of the West Bank. There's also a lot of, there's the terms that are kind of made up, like the Green Line was not ever meant to be, it's not made up, but it was never meant to be a territorial division. And a lot of people would say, well, we should go back to Green Line. Well, the Green Line was never supposed to be the borders in the first place. And so I think that's important to bring up. And also one thing that I think is very important is the idea of what is a Palestinian citizen of Israel. And this is something I run into a lot with Europeans. I have a lot of funny anecdotes with it as well. Like I said, the UN is like 70% Palestinian here, and then 30% European, and then me as the lone Jew. And basically, if you're an Arab in Haifa, an Arab in Akko, never lived in the Palestinian territories, always lived in Israel, your family, you never fled Israeli or violence, a lot of people would still call you a Palestinian citizen of Israel. Now it's complicated because that's an identity for you to choose. a lot of them will call themselves Israelis. I've been in arguments with them as an immigrant to Israel. I've been in arguments with Israeli Arabs who put me down as a foreigner and say that we're Israeli. And they'll tell me, he's like, how are you going to tell me how to act? This is my country. I'm an Israeli. You're a foreigner. That's an Israeli Arab who a lot of people would define as a Palestinian citizen of Israel, and they would not do that. I remember I had a conversation with one of the first conversations I had with one of my colleagues in Gaza, which was like a really fun time. You know, first time you're speaking to Gazans, you have a lot of questions. One of the things I asked was, do you have any Israeli friends? And he said, yeah, of course I have tons of Israeli friends. Mahmoud lives in Yafo. Fatima lives in Akko. My cousin married Halija in Tiberias or whatever. I'm like, you consider them Israelis? He's like, yeah, of course they're Israeli. They're not Palestinian. They live in Israel. So it's complicated, and I think it's just a means in a way. Obviously, again, some Israeli Arabs define themselves purely as Palestinians, but it's also kind of a way to delegitimize Israel by basically excluding 20% of the population and saying, well, actually, they're not Israeli. They're just inherited by Israel, but they're Palestinian, which, again, I leave that identity for them to choose for themselves. My default is Israeli Arab because it's just factual. If they call themselves Palestinian, then that's fine with me too. That's up to them.
And those who live in the West Bank, Judea, and Samaria areas that are controlled by the Palestinian Authority, are they referred to as Palestinian? Are they referred to as Israeli Arabs? How would you categorize them?
I personally would call them Palestinians, 100%. I know that there's a lot of Israeli friends of mine who would get upset by that and say that I'm making up nationalities. But, you know, before 1910, Israeli was a made-up nationality as well. And I'm just being unbiased here.
That I feel like that's a conversation that could take up another whole hour and a half all on its own. Sure. We could reschedule that one for another time. Before we actually get into the misinformation piece, I would actually like to go over one more term because I do think that it's actually almost a bridge. The idea of the Palestinian refugee. That's something that we hear get thrown out a lot. It's something that also has almost its own definition in terms of what a refugee is. Can you talk a little bit about that?
Sure. So firstly, from a international law perspective, which I am, again, not a specialist in, but from my understanding, and I'll give you some evidence of this as well, the Palestinians are the only ones that are considered refugee by birthright. There's not another population like this. And essentially, you know, if you flee, I don't know, Syria to Europe and you have kids with another Syrian in Germany, then your kids are no longer Syrian refugees. The Palestinians are treated quite differently, and it's just a kind of negotiation tactic for a future right of return for Palestinians. Typically, a refugee is viewed as someone who had to flee their country for political reasons or for fear of their life, violence, war, things like that. In the case of Palestinians, again, this also includes their descendants. So there's Palestinian refugees throughout the world. A lot of them, for instance, Christian Palestinians live in Chile. It's like 300,000 people live there, 300,000 Palestinian Christians, for instance. But during the war, during the Independence War, a lot of Arabs who were living in what is now Israel proper fled to the neighboring Arab states, which became basically the West Bank, mostly Jordan, which is now the West Bank, which is, I'll get into that in a second, but they also fled to Syria. They also fled to Lebanon. A lot of them fled to Europe. Many fled to, there was Iraqi Palestinian refugees. Egypt took in a lot of them, and there's just a ton. So eventually the borders got defined. Jordan became Jordan, and the Palestinians who moved into what is now Jordan proper are Palestinians in Jordan. I'm not sure if Jordan treats them as refugees, though. I think Jordan might have given them citizenship, but I can't say for sure. The West Bank Palestinians who were always there, let's say they weren't impacted by the war, are just Palestinians. So it's complicated, right? Like essentially, I'll give you a Jewish example. There's Bukhari Jews. I'm from the Soviet Union originally, so I'm familiar with this. So there's Bukhari Jews, and then there's Ashkenazi Jews living in Bukhara. And they're the same, they're both Jews, they live in the same city, but one's Bukhari, one's Ashkenazi, right? So same with the Palestinians in the sense that there's Palestinians who, let's say, have always lived in Bethlehem. They're Palestinians, they're not refugees. They never moved, they never were impacted by the wars, you know, in the sense of having to flee. And then there's Palestinians who might have fled from Yafo, for instance, to Bethlehem, and they're refugees because they sought refuge somewhere else from the war. And again, you have them in refugee camps throughout the West Bank. In Lebanon, I believe Lebanon has not given them citizenship for the sake of what they do, what they say specifically. This isn't made up. They want the Palestinians to keep the fire going to fight for their homeland. So for that, they intentionally don't want to integrate them into their societies in Lebanon and Syria.
That's a really interesting point. And again, one I'm sure we could have a whole other hour of discussion about why Palestinians were considered refugees for so long, why they weren't given citizenship. But this is certainly something that should probably play into the conversation when we're discussing why there are so many Palestinian refugees and why there have been for a long time. It's probably something that should be discussed more when discussing the whole conflict with Israel and Palestine. Before we move on, I would like to welcome everybody who is just joining us. We are discussing the Anti-Israel Misinformation campaign with Lev Yuriditsky here on Israeli Politics Simplified and Kerem House's series Poli-Talks. So let's get into the misinformation piece. Sure. So just to start out, what do we consider to be misinformation? We're using this term a lot. What is misinformation? Why is it damaging? What does it matter? People can have whatever narrative they want. People can give their opinions. What is this thing that we're all talking about now?
It's a very good question. I think there's a bit of blurred lines with misinformation because you can have false information, which I think is naturally is misinformation, especially when it's intentional. I think intent has some relevancy here, but for me, I think the clearest misinformation is simply sharing non-truths using inaccurate terminology. For instance, people still talk about settlers in Gaza. We left Gaza a long time ago, and people still talk about the occupation of Gaza. That's, to me, misinformation, whether it's intended to be or not. There's also what a lot of Israelis, and I'm obviously very pro-Israel, but what I find, and I kind of I regret that I see with a lot of Israelis and Jews that I know who support Israel is that they attack everything as misinformation if it's just lacking a certain context that they wish was shared. At the end of the day, this is a conflict that every time you add context, you can add a counter context to it, even accurately. So if you go back and you say, well, Israel attacked Hamas, Israel bombed Gaza because Hamas attacked Israel. Okay, fine. So now let's say, for instance, I'll give a clear example. I'd say, basically, for a lot of Israelis and for a lot of Jews, if you say that Israel bombed Gaza without adding that Israel bombed in retaliation, that's a misinformation. I would say it's kind of unfair and biased, but lacking context for me personally is not exactly misinformation. It's just poor reporting, so to speak. But if you were to add that, if you were to add the fact that, Israel retaliated and that's why we bombed Gaza, then a pro-Palestinian person can say, well, that's misinformation because you're missing why Hamas bombed Israel in the first place, and then goes back and forth. So basically for me, I think misinformation is just sharing either lies or inaccurate terminology, just like genocide, ethnic cleansing, war crime when it's not actually a war crime, and things like that.
So let's talk about some of these terms because they get thrown out quite a bit. We hear things like, disproportionate response. We hear things like Israel is, trying to do ethnic cleansing, things like that. Let's talk about some of these terms and see if we can try to dispel some of the misinformation, try to clear up some of the things that have been going on. Why don't we start with disproportionate? Because that seems to be a big part of the argument that we're hearing from, I know that, Trevor Noah and John Oliver and their commentaries that have now become infamous, let's say, certainly within more pro-Israel circles, that's something that's come up quite a bit, is this disproportionate response. Let's talk about that a little bit. What do you think should be said instead, or what are they referring to?
Sure, and I think that's a really interesting one to start off with because that's a really blurred area. It's kind of like, how can you really argue whether it's proportionate or not? You have to define proportionality first and foremost, and maybe you'll find that maybe it is disproportionate. Does that mean that then would I say that Trevor Noah and John Oliver are practicing misinformation? I would think that they're just missing a lot of context. Or let's say, for instance, the way I view it is I can say, sure, it's disproportionate, but it's necessary and there's no other choice, and it's fair. You know what I mean? So the first question I would ask is not whether it's true or false that it's disproportionate, because I think it's a very complicated term and it's, again, irrelevant. If a small person is attacking a big person, the big person responds, hits him harder than the small person can hit him. That's probably factually disproportionate. I can hand it to the person. That's disproportionate. But that's all the means that you have, and you're justified using those means. So I don't have so much a problem with the term disproportionate. I have more of a problem of why does it matter? Why does it matter? Like, what are our options? Like, I feel like that I don't understand the reason that that the discussion about proportionality is even on the table. I think the discussion should be about justified or not, and disproportionate force can be justified the same way. If you're being attacked by a knife and you only have a gun to defend yourself with, and you're in your home and you can't flee, it's disproportionate by this standard to shoot the person, but it's not unjust to shoot the person. So again, that's why I think the term misinformation is a bit, is not that it's inaccurate, but it's also, even if it is accurate, even if the term disproportionate is accurate here, and then we can say, fine, they're not misinforming the population. What they're doing is bringing something that's irrelevant to the discussion. And the more important idea is not to denounce it as fake news, but to say, yeah, disproportionate, but justified. And bring the question back. If you were able to have a discussion with Trevor Noah, I would just ask him, okay, so give me an example of what you would do instead. What is our option here? And again, then if you want, and a lot of people have been doing this and to good effect, is kind of reframing the argument. Like, is proportionality the results, basically how deaths versus deaths, or is it quantity of rockets versus quantity of rockets? Is it targeting of civilians versus indiscriminate targeting of civilians versus deliberate targeting of military sites and other targets? So I think that if someone were to argue with me, I can easily say, fine, it's disproportionate, but it was justified, and prove me otherwise. Or I can say, well, okay, well, let's really look at it. Your proportionality is just based on results and like deaths. I would say that you can measure proportionality in effort to kill innocent civilians, which Hamas did more of and Israel did less of. You can measure it in quantity of rockets, which I'm assuming Hamas launched more rockets. Sure, there were worse rockets, but are we measuring firepower? Even if you take if you weigh the gunpowder and explosive devices together, maybe Hamas used more. I don't know. But the point is, it's either irrelevant or you can reframe the argument. But it's hard to say that's totally misinformed, if you ask me.
How about ethnic cleansing? That's one we hear a lot as well.
Yeah, so ethnic cleansing is an insane term to use, in my opinion, because it's factually inaccurate. And that's kind of like, you can't ethnically cleanse people and see their population grow at a rate faster than any country in Europe. So that's something I always say. Like, if people say the Jews control the world and that we're good at everything that we do and everything like that. So how is it the only thing we're not good at is ethnically cleansing? You can prove that. You can prove it statistically, and you can prove birth rates. You can show that there are more houses being built. There are more babies being born. Clearly, we're not cleansing, and you can also just show statistic death rates at Israeli hands year on and or year to year, and show that it's actually pretty small. We don't really kill that many Palestinians.
We talked about apartheid a little bit, but I think it's important to discuss that a little bit further. It's a word that I get the impression that not a lot of people know the actual definition of what an apartheid state is. And it's something that gets used about us constantly. Let's talk about what exactly is apartheid, what makes a country apartheid, why is Israel being blamed of being an apartheid state?
Sure. So apartheid is, if I'm not mistaken, it's an Afrikaner term. And it's basically the same way that saying you're doing a Holocaust on a country is, referencing the Holocaust. When you say that, apartheid is just a term referencing the policies of the South African government, I think from probably the 50s to 1994 or something like that, towards the blacks, coloreds, and basically there's different races of the country. So there's different rules that apply to them, different rights that apply to them, different freedoms and privileges for the white population of South Africa versus the blacks and the coloreds, which is it's not a racist term. The coloreds are a minority in Africa. That's their name, as well as for the Indians. So that is apartheid, essentially what street you can walk on, where you can live, what schools you can go to, and things like that. And look, in the end of the day, there's various levels of, like the same way there's various levels of oppression before you get to ethnic cleansing, there's various levels of separation of population before you get to apartheid. It's an extreme in a way. And I do think that if you treat Israel as one, one state with two people, including the West Bank, including the Palestinian territories, which is, I don't see why you would do that. But if you were to do that, it can be argued that it's an apartheid state. It can. If the Palestinians living in Ramallah were Israeli citizens and they're treated the way they are today, you can say it's apartheid state. But simply put, that's not the case. I mean, it's completely different law. You know, it's completely different. For all intents and purposes, it's different countries, just not recognized by the UN. But again, that's what the problem is. People say, well, they treat their Palestinian population as a different, as differently than the Israelis. I'm like, well, the Palestinian population is not under Israel, so why? It's like saying America's apartheid state because of their treatment of Mexicans in Mexico. It's not our country. You know, we don't have anything to do with them. Israel does have restrictions on Palestinians in the West Bank from traveling out through Israel, but that's because we, you know, as a country have a right to determine who from another country comes into our country. So you can argue that Israel does a lot to limit the sort of rights of the Palestinians, but it's also very kind of hard to limit the population of another country. But they do in some ways by establishing checkpoints between different cities and establishing roads that they can't use. But again, it's very complicated because there's roads that Palestinians can't use, there's roads that they can use, there's shared roads. You know, there's territory where you see Israeli citizens and Palestinian, Palestinian nationals together. But for instance, you know, a Palestinian with a Palestinian plate vehicle cannot just drive into Tel Aviv. And I think there's only like 50 or 60 that are allowed to do that. And they're either very elite businessmen or very prestigious doctors that work in Israeli hospitals. So anyway, if you include that and Gaza as part of Israel, then that's why people often say that we're an apartheid state. But, you know, considering the fair treatment of Israeli Arabs who are Israeli citizens, 20% of the country, it's very arguable. I mean, it's very clear that we're not an apartheid state.
Right. And I think that's a really important point to make. And that's also one of the reasons why I wanted to have our vocabulary lesson, so to speak, because I think people really do not understand that there are very different things going on, what we would call an Israeli Arab living in Haifa and the rights that he might have versus an Arab living in Ramallah and what he might be able to do. They're very, very different things. And while there might not have been a Palestinian election, where there might have been, the fact of the matter is that there is a Palestinian Authority who is controlling these Palestinian citizens, and they're in control of what kind of rights they have and what kind of lives they lead. And I think that's a really important point for people to understand and realize the distinction between the two. What would you say is one of the more damaging tropes or you know, phrases of misinformation that you've heard over the last little while?
I think what's really bothersome is when people use just made up numbers that don't apply. And it's just because, you know, when you use subjective terminology, or even I get bothered when people use objective terminology subjectively. You know, if you say it's illegal, it's a war crime. And I think John Oliver at one point said, shouldn't that be a war crime? And I'm like, well, I mean, a war crime is a war crime. And like, there's legal definitions of what a crime is, and there's legal definitions of war crime, and either is or it isn't. So I don't like that when people use specific terminology subjectively. Again, ethnic cleansing, genocide, apartheid. I get bothered by, I really don't like disproportionate. Again, like I just think the whole discussion about proportionality bothers me because it's the point is discussion. It's really a point of discussion. Proportionality does not dictate whether an act of war was just or unjust. And that's what we should be discussing. As far as I mentioned earlier, numbers, you know, I've had discussions with people who say you kill thousands of Palestinians every day or hundreds of Palestinian children a day. And then you come back and you say, well, can you give me a proper number? Like, how many did we kill in the past month? And they can't answer that. And then you can give them a number like, well, we killed 30. And then obviously they'll say, well, you think that's okay? It's like, well, no, I'm not saying it's okay necessarily, but you can always ask, well, in that case, how many are we allowed to kill? 0? Or, I mean, do you accept that there's casualties, like innocent casualties of war? I really don't like the fact that Israel, first of all, people use the term colonialism. As far as I understand, vocabulary. Colonialism, you have to be a colony of someplace. Namibia was not a colony of nothing. It was a German colony. The U.S. was a British colony. Parts of Canada were a French colony. What are we a colony of? It makes no sense to me. Especially European colonialism, I think it's a problem we have in Israeli society, where we kind of prioritize Ashkenazim in this country to some extent. It's obviously getting better, but I do think that also creates the impression that we're a country of Europeans, where it's just factually inaccurate. And I wish, I think the conflict will be viewed a lot differently if people understood how much of this country is Israelis that descended from Arab countries. What percentage of this country is Moroccan, Tunisian, Algerian, Iraqi, Egyptian. And I really wish that more people understood that, because we do have this impression that it's just a bunch of Polacks who moved over to the Middle East and took over, just like the Europeans who took over Nigeria or India or whatever. So that bothers me. Yeah. Also, targeting bothers me a lot. I really hate that term, because it's like, well, I can really disprove that we're targeting civilians if it takes 20 of the most expensive missiles in the planet to kill one child or one person. I think we're doing a really bad job of targeting. So it's just inaccurate.
So who do you think is feeding this misinformation? Where is it starting from and spreading out of? Is it the mainstream media? Is it politicians? Now we also have this new phenomenon of this rise of social media. It's almost taking over in a lot of ways. Is that where it's coming from? Or where's the beginning of this campaign?
I would say it's mixed in the way, like, I think it's a feedback loop rather than one feeding the other, in a way. I think it's very easy. Israel's a very easy target. We just look like the bad guy, and I can understand from the outside, from an uninformed perspective, I can understand why. I know very, very little about Rohingya, but to me, it seems like the Rohingya people are the victims. I don't need to know much more. I should. I don't have a voice on that. I don't have an opinion on that conflict. I don't speak on that conflict. It's not a very popular conflict, but they seem like the victims. But it could be very complicated. I have no idea what's actually going on there. Tibetans seem like the victims to me. It's just Taiwan seems like the victim of China to me. So I think that for the average public, before you dig into what happens in Israel, it's very easy to see the Palestinians as a victim, and I can understand why. They're the losing party. They lost a war. They're under blockade. They don't really have their own country. They don't have their own airport. They don't have they don't have the same power as Israel. Israel can go into the middle of the night and, take a wanted person from Ramallah from his home. But can you imagine the Palestinian security forces did that to Tel Aviv? We seem like the bad guys, and it makes sense. And Israelis can argue, and I would argue too, like, well, it's justified. We're doing that because we have to. You don't have that room for conversation. The flash visual of dead Palestinians, of crying Palestinian mothers, of body bag after body bag, creates the impression that we are the bad guys and they're the victims. And I think the media plays off of that because it's easy to play off of that, and it's an easy sell. I'm not gonna get into American politics, but there's other things in America that are easy to sell as well. And the media plays off of that. The people buy into it. Then the people kind of look for, kind of on a witch hunt for further evidence of this. So social media feeds this, and then the media feeds back social media, and then the celebrities. I don't even know if I think they're probably misinformed. I don't think anyone's doing it intentionally. I just think that they see this is what the population believes. I'm going to side with the population. It's going to give me popularity, or maybe they just genuinely believe it. The same way a well-meaning person believes in freeing Tibet. Do they know anything about Tibet? I don't, and I don't think they do either. It could be just, it could be unjust. I have no idea what's going on there, but most people think that they do, so they speak out about it. And so again, I think it's easy to play into that. It's easy to it's very obvious if you want to be popular, which side do you stand by.
I think it would also be fair to say, tell me if you agree with this, but the rise in the popularity and the far-reaching tentacles of social media, of influencers, of these voices has probably made this a lot worse or a much bigger problem than it might have been.
As far as the problem
of spreading misinformation, of gaining steam almost.
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, in the end of the day, if you have one picture that shows victimhood of the Palestinians and like three people share. I mean, I studied Africa for years, and there's tragic stuff that happens every day. There's Nakbas happen in like almost every African country like several times a month. So, but no one cares. But if people cared about it, all you have to do is show one picture, one tweet, and if it's popular enough and it's an easy way to get fans and to get support and likes, then it's just an easy option to share that. So for sure, the general public interest and the growth of influencers and social media has definitely led to the spread.
I'd also just like to bring in the UN just for a second here, because this is a more recent decision. I don't know how many people know about it, but the UN Human Rights Council recently voted to put a permanent probe into Israel for war crimes, for human rights violations. And the UN, I mean, it's an official body. It has influence. It has sway over public opinion. Do you think that that's something that will continue to play a role in how Israel is framed in the media? Do you think it has a real influence in how people are framing Israel in social media?
I personally think not. Maybe I'm wrong, but I think it's very easy to ignore the UN. I mean, I don't think they're that relevant. It's just kind of like, I think people are much more interested in what, I think you said Gigi Hadid or whichever that celebrity's name is. I think they're much more interested in what the Kardashians have to say about the Palestinian conflict than what the UN has to say. And honestly, the UN can't be as impassioned when it speaks, so it's not interesting. When the UN wants what Gigi Hadid or whoever else can say something like they're killing thousands, there's a genocide, it's a massacre, blah blah blah. The UN is still bound to some extent by accuracy, to some extent, when it's speaking as a unified voice. The individuals there can say what they want. The UN can't say that kind of stuff. It can't misinform as much. The UN is restricted to things like, we condemn in the strongest of terms the actions of the Israelis, and we call on both sides to return to the table. I mean, it's not interesting to the general public. Mm-hmm. And I saw recently about that vote, and honestly, again, it's a legal question. I barely understand what that means, like a permanent probe. We've had so many investigations on war crimes against American leaders, against Israeli leaders. It's nothing. It's lip service in the end of the day, and I haven't seen it influence much beyond sometimes people saying the UN condemned Israel. What do you have to say about that? When the UN's been condemning Israel since forever, so it doesn't really change anything, in my opinion.
Can you think of any reason why it seems like this time around, this misinformation PR campaign has swelled to the size of that it did, had the impact that it did, had such far-reaching consequences that it did? I mean, we're going to speak a little bit more about anti-Semitism now, but can you think of why this time might have been different?
Interesting enough, firstly, I would say for me, it didn't feel too different.
Really?
Yeah, I mean, I was in the middle of my job at the Middle East North Africa division of Max back in 2014, and again, I was really engaged with Twitter and social media way more than I am today. I'm still on Twitter and Instagram, and I see what people are saying, and I follow it. But back then, I felt the exact same way back then, that there was so much misinformation. Absolutely. I mean, the term genocide, ethnic cleansing, Holocaust, targeted killings, thousands of kids, apartheid. It's all been around since then, and I just think it's a recurrence. I really see this as just a clone of what happened in 2014 with a bit of a change. A slight change. I think in the level of anti-Semitism that played out in the streets as this time around. But as far as the general voices in social media, I felt it was really similar. I didn't hear any new terms. I didn't think about how long Roger Waters has been, boycotting or pressuring artists to boycott Israel. It's been the same ever since. I don't feel any different personally.
Right. So we do know, though, that there has been a massive rise in anti-Semitism over the past few weeks. And it seems like it has absolutely been connected to the conflict with Israel and Gaza, to what's been going on in Israel, to the misinformation going on mainstream and social media. Something that people bring up a lot is that, it's completely legitimate to criticize a government, and it's completely legitimate to be anti-Israel or anti-Zionism. Where does the legitimate criticism end and the anti-Semitism begin?
I would say I would draw a very clear line that anti-Semitism is when you start attacking Jews and Jewish institutions that have nothing really to do with Israel. If you're a Jewish institution that's not Israel, let's say you're the World Zionist Organization, then it's fair to attack that without, being accused of anti-Semitism. I think, well, to define legitimate, let's leave out the word legitimate, because criticism of a government, whether it's legit or not, is very subjective. But I would say that once it starts going towards Jews, towards, let's say, for instance, politicians start saying we have too many Jews in government who are influencing the decisions on Israel and so on and so forth, then you become a bit anti-Semitic. You can target the specific Jews whose whole career has been defending Israel, fine. You're targeting them for their actions in favor of Israel. You're not targeting them for being Jewish. Once it becomes you're attacking a synagogue, you're driving through LA saying, where are your Jews? When you're riding through England with Palestinian flags and saying, we're going to rape Jews and things like that. I feel like that's, a very clear line where it becomes direct anti-Semitism. And I think there's no doubt about it. I think there's no doubt about that.
And does the idea that Israel being the only Jewish state, can you, criticize that? Can you criticize their actions? Can you criticize their existence? Is there any connection between that, anti-Israel sentiment and that, whether or not that's anti-Semitic? Where's the distinction between them?
So it's a good question. It's hard to say what's in someone's heart. Like if someone is anti-Israel, the fact that we're the only Jewish state, it's easy to say in that case, well, why are you against us, but not against the actions of Pakistan or the actions of Saudi Arabia or something like that? And it's easy in that case too. And I've seen a lot of people say that it's because we're the Jewish state. For me, I feel like I need a lot more evidence to claim anti-Semitism than that, because I think a lot of it just simply comes from the spotlight is on us. People aren't talking about Pakistan. People aren't talking about Rohingya. People aren't talking about the Tuaregs. People aren't talking about the Fulanis. And people aren't talking about the Middle Belt conflict in Nigeria. People are talking about Israel. And that's why, in my opinion, that's one of the reasons that you can legitimately criticize this country simply from an angle of ignorance. You simply don't know about the other conflicts. I study conflicts for a living for years. And even in the UN, like my whole job was conflict resolution to an extent. And, I engage with people involved in conflicts throughout the world. So I'm familiar with these things. I'm not saying it to brag. I'm just saying that I'm aware, and I'm aware how people
brag. That's fine.
But my point is, I understand from conversations how little people know about the conflicts throughout the rest of the world. And I think it's fair to say that, as regrettable as it is, a lot of times the criticism, the focus on Israel is two things. A, it's ignorance about the conflicts elsewhere. And the spotlight on Israel is, related to that. Also, again, the misinformation about how bad it is here. And I'll tell you, I have, I've met a lot of people who visit Israel and aren't Jews and they aren't familiar with Israel. And one thing I asked them, I always say, what's the first thing that surprised you about this place? And they said that, well, I saw Arabs on the streets. I saw that most people here are pretty secular, and that, there are mosques and there's signs in Arabic. And we really believe before coming here that there's a complete separation. And so again, the spotlight, the idea of what's actually going on in Israel, people really believe that, we go out as Jews and beat up Arabs with baseball bats and shoot them for no reason. So again, I think the way it's really hard to tell if someone's being purely anti-Semitic in their discourse on Israel. And I would caution fellow Israel supporters to hold back that kind of attack on someone until you really have evidence that it is because they're Jewish, especially considering the fact that some of the real anti-Semites, some of the biggest neo-Nazis in the world and far-right parties who actually hate Jews and have always hated Jews are supporters of Israel for the sake of, well, we want you guys out of Europe. So, have your own country in the Middle East, and that's no problem for us. So again, I think it's very complicated. It's the same way someone can say, Lev's attacking Hamas or Gaza because they're Palestinian. He's anti-Palestinian, and I think you need to have very clear evidence before you make an accusation such as anti-Semitism and so on.
And do you think that the fact that there is such a spotlight on Israel, I mean, that seems to indicate a problem. We know that there are conflicts all over the world. We know that there have been massive tragedies all over the world. What's going on in Syria, what's going on in China with the Uyghur Muslims. I mean, there's serious problems around the world, and you don't hear nearly as much about them as you do about Israel. So that spotlight seems to be somewhat problematic in and of itself.
Problematic in that you think that,
and that there seems to be, for lack of a better word, a disproportionate amount of attention on Israel than there is on the rest of the world, and especially when you consider some of the things that we're talking about. The fact that there are Israeli Arabs here, they make up a nice amount of the population, they do have equal rights. So that seems to be part of the problem. Is this attention?
It is part of the problem, for sure it is, and I think there's numerous reasons for it. First off, we are. Look, it's the same reason that a school shooting in New York that would kill 5 people will get way more attention than a suicide bomb in Quetta, Pakistan, where a Sunni will kill 30 Shiite worshippers at a mosque. You wouldn't hear about that. But 5 kids killed in a school in suburban New York, you would hear about it for months. There'll be visuals for it. And first off, I think there's a bias towards the first world. There's a bias towards the developing world. I think there's a lot of that. We're more interested in it. We feel like we relate to them more. We feel like it's unusual. In the end, when we see a wave of protests in Colombia and the government shooting them down, we treat it differently than if it would happen in Paris. And I think, again, we're viewed as a European country. We are we're very developed. We're doing better than some European countries from my perspective, and we're seen as part of Europe. And if you see us as that in that way, and then you take the information that you're being fed, that at the same time we have an apartheid state, where we have an open air prison in Gaza, where killing hundreds of Palestinian kids a day, then of course there's gonna be more attention on us doing it than Pakistan, which doesn't have running water. Not all of Pakistan, of course, but.
All right, so I'd like to spend the rest of the time that we have speaking about strategies for how to actually deal with this. I mean, this misinformation isn't going away, the spin isn't going away. It's something that, we'll have to contend with now, we'll have to contend with it the next time there's an escalation. And it seems like we were almost a little bit caught off guard in a way, with how big and loud it really got. So how should we be fighting this? Should we be moving more to, offense instead of defense? Should we have a larger social media presence? What do you think would work best here?
We as Jewish people, or
as Jewish people, as Israel, as pro-Israel people, anybody that wants to be getting in on the action.
Sure. Well, I'll say, I mean, the interesting thing about it is what you said is that I was actually at a friend's house yesterday, and we were watching videos from 2009 and from the previous engagements, and it actually, again, I wasn't caught off guard, and I think anyone who's been around for the past conflicts probably shouldn't have been as well. As in, if you watch Israeli parodies, if you watch Eretz Nehederet, if you watch like the other Israeli comedy shows, and not even Israeli comedy shows. I mean, there's more serious discussions. It's the exact same thing. Like I remember back in 2009, there was a really good song, kind of, again, a parody, basically saying the world ignores Jewish blood. And then there was another, I saw like a parody rap song also from 2009 saying the same kind of stuff, like exactly everything that we're discussing today, all the misinformation we're discussing today, all the biased information we're discussing today, these fake rappers we're talking about in 2009. I've seen the same in 2014 and onwards. So I don't even think it's new. And actually, the reason I say that is to point out that I think we've been using the same strategy for the past however long, almost 15 years now, at least in the conflicts that we've been engaged in. And probably even before that. I think I was in DC. I grew up in Baltimore, so I was in DC pretty frequently. And I remember distinctly during the Second Intifada, seeing pro-Palestinian protests in DC, where they laid out body bags, fake body bags, of course, demonstrating the amount of Palestinians that were killed. And you see hundreds of people laying in fake body bags. And my dad was there with me, and I remember he was saying, and they're not talking about all the Israelis who were killed in the Dolphinarium, for instance, or in I forgot, in Sbarro Pizza, I think it was, in Jerusalem, or Mike's Cafe. So the disinformation is perpetual, and I think we've used the same strategy, and I think we're also in a very bad place to win the PR campaign. I have things I think we shouldn't do because they make us win, they make us lose even harder to an extent. And I think we really shouldn't play the victimhood card. We shouldn't fight head to head for sympathy. In the end of the day, regardless of the fact that we're I've lived through however many periods of rocket fire and been near many terrorist attacks, and I definitely feel my life has been threatened many times. Despite that, I also know what they're going through in Gaza, and it's almost pathetic if we're trying to compare ourselves to them. And that doesn't mean that they're right and we're wrong. That's not what I'm saying. But that's not the argument we should be having. The same way, if someone, again, using criminal perspective, if someone comes to stab you and you blow his brains out, then it's hard afterwards to present yourself as like, well, look how much I suffered. I was scared for a few seconds, but this guy's laying dead. And again, it's not about right or wrong. It's just it's a losing battle for us to try to get Western sympathy by saying, look, we have a minute and a half or a minute or whatever to run for shelter, and we had to do this several times a day. I'm sorry, like, I hardly pity myself for having to go through that. Like, it sucks. It really does suck, but like, it's almost, I feel like I'm almost telling a lie. So I feel like we're fighting the wrong battle to play for victimhood. We should play for our right to defend ourselves regardless. I don't think that our PR campaign should be about what we have to go through. I think our PR campaign should be about our right to defend ourselves. I think our PR should also, and our Hasbara in general, should not be aimed towards other Jews. Okay, let me take that back for a second. I think, especially the way things are going in the States, more so than in Europe, I think there's various levels of PR. One is targeting our detractors, targeting neutral people. And another one is targeting Jews who kind of been led astray. You know, American Jews tend to be liberal, which is fine. And they run in liberal circles, which generally do not like Israel. And I found many cases of American Jews for the sake of fitting in with their peers, because they agree with them on everything else. They agree with them on BLM. They agree with them on illegal immigration. They agree with them on so many other issues that they don't, it's very uncomfortable for them. And I've seen it, I spoke to them about it. Very uncomfortable for them to be in a gay pride parade or whatever other kind of liberal movement, and then be the only ones who are favoring Israel. And I think we need to reach out to them and teach them how to better defend Israel, and also not even just to defend them, but to understand why we're doing what we're doing and why it's necessary. So I think we need to change our hasbara. We need to change our PR. Again, not playing the victim card. I think we should use more, I would say, attention-grabbing PR, so to speak. Memes, for instance, are very popular. I think we should use those. I seen, for instance, a sign recently. There was a picture in London, I think it was, and it said, I don't know, maybe something like 100 Palestinians were killed today in Gaza. Have a good day. Something like that. Very simple and to the point. Well, I would love to see some similar signs, like just a reminder that the Palestinian Authority is still a dictatorship without elections in 15 years. Good day. Something like that, right? Like fight fire with fire in that kind of way. Or, you know, if you want to pull the liberals away from supporting Hamas, teach them who Hamas is. You know, put out things that basically explain, like, you can't be a woman you're not a woman with rights. And if you're a woman in Gaza, you do not have rights. You cannot. There are no concerts in Gaza for a reason. It's an Islamic run territory. You know, they brutalize and murder their political detractors. You know, I think if you really start teaching liberals that, then you might get some fans. Again, I think we're fighting an uphill battle. I really think we are. And I think we need to speak to the perspective, speak to not the choir, but to our opposition. And we're not doing that. One thing I think that really changed my perspective on things is understanding that most of our detractors believe that we have original sin. And to put that in perspective, when the Germans shot the Warsaw Uprising participants, I don't know how you call them, basically during the Warsaw Uprising, when the Germans shot back, or when the Polish Guard shot back, it was very hard for the Polacks to defend themselves, or Germans to defend themselves and say, we were attacked. Because they have the original sin. You put them in a ghetto. Of course, they're going to rise up against you. So yes, we have the original sin, so you have the original sin. You were right to be attacked, and you are not right to defend yourself. We are viewed as the Germans in this story, and that's what I realized. Because when I have these conversations, and I start saying, okay, but like they launched rockets at us. Like, yeah, but they launched because of the occupation or the blockade. Well, there's a blockade because they bring in weapons. Yeah, but they bring in weapons because of the blockade. And so on and so forth. It goes cyclical. And when you get down to the bottom of it, we don't have a right to defend ourselves because we have the original sin. And I think when we have arguments defending Israel, we're speaking around that. We're going around that, and we're defending something that's no point. Like if someone says we could be the most innocent army. We could destroy Gaza and killed not a single soul. Doesn't matter to anybody, because in the end of the day, we should, even if we didn't touch Gaza, the very situation as it exists today with Gaza being blockaded and Gazans not having the freedoms that, millions of Gazans not having freedoms that normal countries and normal civilians do, we're the bad guys already, whether we fire a bullet or not. So that's why we're fighting an uphill battle. And I think we need to understand that when we're in conversations with them. And I think, again, from a PR perspective, we need to look at this differently. We need to take a different strategy. We need to not play for victimhood. I think from a personal perspective, so to speak, if I were to encourage Jewish and other supporters of Israel to defend Israel in the right way, the tactics and strategies I've had the most success with is just not getting into a head-on battle. And I think it's just normal kind of negotiation tactics. When I debate Israel with pro-Palestinians or anti-Israelis, I agree with them on most everything in the beginning. So we can start in a place where we're friends now. And I know a lot of Israelis won't agree with me. A lot of Israelis are one-staters, for instance, and that's fine. I'm very pro-Israel. I believe in an Israeli state. I also believe in a two-state. So that means I'm a pro-Palestinian. So when I argue with a pro-Palestinian, I'm like, yeah, me too, man. I'm pro-Palestine. You know what I mean? I also don't think that the Jews should take back homes in Sheikh Jarrah. Whether they have a right to, whether it's legal or not, I don't think they need to. And whether the people listening to this agree with me or not, you can find a ton of points you agree with pro-Palestinians or anti-Israeli people. But once you start teaching them what you agree with, once you start finding that kind of common ground, which is very easy to do, you can base a common ground. Like, yeah, I think it's terrible that Gazans, and don't add buts to it. Don't say like, I think it's terrible what Gazans are going through, but they elected Hamas, they shouldn't have launched rockets first. Like, start agreeing with them. Let them loosen up. I always had tons of success with this. Let them loosen up. Let them warm up to you. Let them believe that you're on their side, and you can find that. And then you start asking them questions. Like, put it back to them. Once you start lecturing to someone, which I'm doing now, but once you start lecturing, a lot of times they go on the defensive, and you're not going to get a buy-in from them. I play dumb and ask questions. Again, when people say, Israel is killing tons of Palestinians or whatever, I'm like, oh, that's wild. I didn't know that. How many have we killed? And people say a number. I'm like, wow, that's interesting. It's crazy because I read earlier today it was just a couple hundred. I didn't know it was 10,000. That's a lot. So can you tell me more about this ethnic cleansing? Like, what exactly does Israel do? Well, how many settlers live in Gaza? And I don't say it even sarcastically. I am, but it comes off genuine. Like, well, I didn't know that. That's crazy. Well, how many live there? And then I always bring back the question to them, like, listen, I agree with you. The situation sucks in Gaza. I agree. I think there should be a solution. I think there should be a solution in Gaza. I think there should be a solution to the West Bank. But in the immediate term, we're being bombed. So please tell me what we're supposed to do. And I'm saying this is how I kind of manage these conversations. It's an agreement. Like, yes, what Israel's doing in Gaza is bad. Whether I agree with that or not is another story. But I'll say what Israel's doing in Gaza is bad. It's terrible. People are not living the lives they should live. They don't deserve that. We should make an improvement. I also put a lot of pressure on Hamas. I put the pressure on the PA. I put the pressure on the Iranians, the international community. Totally agree with you, though. The life of Gazans is not one I'd want to live, and they don't deserve that. But in the meantime, we're being fired at. So you can tell me what to do and give me an idea, and then always bring them back. And they'll say, well, you shouldn't be there in the first place. Yeah, but we are here. I'm not leaving, and I live here. This is my job. Is family's here or whatever. Please tell me what I can do. So I think it's difficult. Like, again, like we're all human in the end of the day. So all I'm saying is that if you're pro-Israeli and you want to convince someone to understand your side, don't argue with them and don't get passionate into it. Manipulate them. I'm just being very direct. Like, manipulate them into getting to the answer that you want to get to, or to, teach them that they don't know what they're talking about. Ask questions that they don't know the answer to. Ask them how many people live in Sheikh Jarrah. But you should inform yourself about that first. Ask yourself, like, know the answers to these questions. very, very simple question. I always ask people, and I'll cut this off in a second because I don't want to run out of time. But basically, I ask people, how many deaths do you accept in a conflict? And how many deaths per missile? So let's say, again, if Israel kills one person for every 20 airstrikes, is that targeting civilians? Like, can you define that in one of the most densely populated places in the world, where if I simply shoot an AK-47 in the air, I kill more people by the bullets falling than we have with missile fire? I would ask you, is that evidence that we're targeting civilians or not? And again, I'm just talking about conversations I've had with people, but I feel like that works. So yeah, that's that.
Do you think that I know that we're almost out of time. I have a couple more questions if it's okay
Sure.
with you. Do you think that there's any sense in almost bringing the conversation to terms that, for example, for the left wing of, the United States can get behind? For example, there was like right in the middle of the war, there was I think National or International Day Against Homophobia, right? And literally, I was looking on Instagram, and there were people posting in their stories. There was one post about that, and literally in the next post, it was about what was going on in Gaza, and free Gaza, free Palestine, and some anti-Israel sentiment. And I am literally looking at this, and I think I actually pointed out, in Gaza, there is homophobia. There is, all these issues. You can get killed for being gay. You're not allowed. I think Bill Maher actually said the other day on his show, you're not allowed to walk around alone in Gaza if you're a woman without permission from a man. Like, these are all things that seem to be, core values, or, core concepts to the left that has been pretty anti-Israel. Do you think it makes sense to make these points to them and almost bring the conversation to their, I don't want to say level, but to the things that they care about?
I personally don't. I think it's disingenuous, and I think it's very transparent.
Mm-hmm.
It's just kind of deflecting. It's what people call pink washing. Which, listen, at the end of the day, Israel has very good treatment of homosexuals for the most part. Obviously, there's always ways to improve, but and it's fine to highlight that without pink washing. But when you try to say there's a problem, right? The problem is that in the eyes of our detractors, we're killing, again, thousands of Palestinians a day. True or not, that's what they believe. To come back and say, yes, we are, but they kill gay people every now and then. It's not a good argument, in my opinion. It's again, I've seen that with liberals. I've seen people use that, and they're like, yeah, I'm not saying Hamas is great. I mean, it's also likewise, like, liberals tend to be very anti-nationalism, but what the hell is the Palestinian movement if it's not a nationalistic movement? It's a purely nationalistic movement. And, you can put down, people who are doing the right thing, if that makes sense. Like, people will put down Mandela for things that he did. Well, he's a womanizer, or Gandhi was a racist and bad to his wife. But who cares in the end of the day? Like, it's just, again, I find it disingenuous. Forget about being disingenuous. I find it ineffective. If I was a liberal and someone said to me, if I was defending the Tibetans and someone said, but did you know that Tibetans actually don't like gays? I'll be like, okay, like, I don't like that about them either. But in the end of the day, I still think that you're a human being and you deserve to be treated like a human being. And, again, in the eyes of pro-Palestinians, not have your kids killed. Again, it's not true. That's not what we do, but that's what they believe. So to say, yeah, we're killing, hundreds of kids a day, sure, but did you hear about that execution of that homo? It doesn't work that way.
Right. I completely hear that perspective. It makes sense. I sometimes just wonder if that might bring more value in terms of separating Hamas from Palestinian people. Something I've seen a lot of Israelis say is, yeah, we want to help the Palestinians. We don't like the way that they're living. Part of that reason is Hamas. Why are you putting all of this pressure on Israel? Where's pressure on Hamas here? Do you think that there is some value in bringing those arguments if it's specifically on that point?
I do think there has to be, I agree with you on that. I do think there has to be a lot more discussion about what Hamas is doing to its own people. I think more so in its behavior towards Israel and providing evidence that Hamas does not care about the liberation of Palestinians. It cares about its own popularity. And that's something I wanted to bring up earlier, but I forgot to. But basically, one thing is it's easy to bring up and say, I've said this to you before, why do you think Hamas launched rockets? And people say, well, because they're fighting back against Al-Aqsa, the raid of Al-Aqsa and Sheikh Jarrah. I'm like, okay, but do you think that the rockets would actually stop it? Like, would the rockets lead to a result? Like, if you look at the past 4 or 5 engagements, clearly every time Hamas has attacked Israel, we've killed hundreds of people, we destroyed tons of buildings, we caused millions and millions of dollars of damage, and we set them back in everything that they fought for during times of calm. And they've got expanded nautical reach, they got more permits, they got more humanitarian rights and things like that. A lot of easing of restrictions that I was involved in the UN are all set back now. And Hamas knew that was going to happen. And they did it in spite, they knew exactly what was going to happen. There was no result that's going to happen of this conflict. And I think it's much easier to point to the evidence that that Hamas does not care about its people, and use that as an example rather than point to things like their treatment of women and stuff like that.
I do know that there are a couple of organizations that do work to dispel some of this misinformation, that do work to, bring more of an educational framework to the discussion. Organizations like Open Door Media, Honest Reporting, NGO Monitor. Granted, they all do different things. Do you think that there's something that can be improved on their approach? Do you think that they're, missing a key piece to this?
Yeah, I think what there needs to be is an organization like them that's actually neutral. And I don't read too much. I used to read NGO Monitor, their reports, and I've read some Honest Reporting. Accurate or not, they're one-sided in the end of the day. And I don't think NGO Monitor is going to attack a pro-Israel NGO, or Honest Reporting is going to, when Israel says something, when the Israeli papers say something pro-Israel or Western papers say something pro-Israel, I don't think Honest Reporting is going to target them. And that takes away your legitimacy. I don't think the same reason I wouldn't read the publications regularly or ever of Breaking the Silence, because I know that they're biased. So why would I read them? I think that that people that are detractors aren't going to read NGO Monitor. I think it'll be great if there was a NGO that was unbiased, and I think that a neutral party would genuinely see the justification behind what Israel does. It will criticize Israel where it needs to be criticized. It will criticize the Palestinians where it needs to be criticized. But your legitimacy will only be if you show that you are unbiased and that you criticize both sides equally, and you gain the trust of both sides of the debate.
Before we sign off, because I know that we are really at the end of our time here, there are so many people, average people in Israel, in America, in Europe, all over the place, who want to make a difference, who want to support Israel, who maybe even want to support the Palestinians in terms of how their lives are led under Hamas's rule in Gaza. There are people who want to make an impact in this conversation, whether it be on social media or otherwise. What do you think is the best way for these people to have their voices heard and for them to make a difference in this conversation?
As individuals, I think the important thing is to just be civilized in debate. If you're uncivilized in debate, and it's not just a call to being nice, you don't always have to be nice. It's just more of a matter of you lose the person that you're trying to convince once you start being uncivilized. I think, again, just sticking to what I was saying earlier about strategy, get to a place where you can agree on enough things. And then the main points, that's where the disagreement is. I think a lot of pro-Israel people I know can say that they're pro-Palestinian. If you're a two-stater, then you're pro-Palestine in the end of the day, if you believe in a second state. And I think if you start introducing yourself that way, not even as a lie, but as genuine, and if you start finding, I know it's an old trope, it's super cliche, but if you start finding common ground with the people you're debating with, and don't just say things to upset them, don't say things just to get a rise out of people or to convince your own side. If you really start looking for common ground, then you can have a much more honest debate. I've done this a lot, and I find it quite successful. I I think that's what they need to do, and also not to be afraid. I think, supporters of Israel need not hide. Don't tuck in your Star of David. I know it's difficult in America and probably here as well, but in the States and Europe, walking around Star of David or Kippah is in some ways a risk to some people. And so if you feel like you're at threat of physical violence, then I guess I won't encourage that. But I think I really encourage, especially liberals who are kind of uncomfortable with their pro-Israel position in the face of their, other liberal stances. I think it's very important for them to speak up, and they have the ears, they have the attention of other liberals. And if they can learn how to explain the conflict well and just inform themselves about the conflict and present it to their peers, I think that there's a good bet there. And I would also say that just general outreach. Again, I know it's cliche, but if I was in the States, reach out to Muslim organizations, have honest conversations with them, try to understand their side. And that's not to say to give up your own side. That's not to say to become anti-Israel, but just, show them that you're not, show them that you're not an aggressor. Show them that you're a reasonable person. Show them that, you might be Jewish, pro-Israel, you might have served in the army, you might have gone into Gaza, but that you aren't just someone who's out to kill. And again, cliche as it is, and probably hard to convince people to do that, but I think that those kind of things kind of make a difference.
That's great. Lev, thank you so much. This was fascinating. I'd love to even just get an hour of stories from you about your experience working for the UN here. I'm sure it would have been amazing, but this is such a timely topic, and I know it's something that many people all over the world have been wrestling with and struggling with, and just to bring some clarity to some of the terms and phrases that we're hearing a lot, and why they might be correct, incorrect, and figuring out strategies moving forward, I think is something that so many people will appreciate moving forward. And I'm certainly glad to have had the opportunity to hear more from someone else on this. So thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Meira. It's been a pleasure.
And thank you all for tuning in. Please be sure to follow Kerem House and Israeli Politics Simplified on Facebook to get more information about any upcoming events that we may have. There's always going to be more coming, so stay tuned for more of those updates. Thank you all and have a great night.